I'm Chanale, and this is the Weekly Squeeze on Moral Edge. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Israeli army had Damascus surrounded. The Syrian military was battered. The road was open. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said, keep going. But Golda Meir said no. The Americans wanted a ceasefire, and Israel pulled back. 2 years later, there was yet another war. The Rebbe had predicted it. He had been saying for years that Israel's pattern of fighting until the pressure got too intense and then stopping was not a strategy. It was idiotic repetition. You fight, you pause, you withdraw, and the other side rebuilds. And then you do it again, except now there are more weapons and more tunnels and more dead. He had a name for it, mowing the grass. You cut it back, it grows. You cut it more, and it grows again. And the families paying for that cycle are not the people making the decisions. His Hasidim described him talking about Israel's wars with something way beyond just analysis. The Lubavitcher Rebbe tracked the maps. He knew the terrain. He gave countless sichos that ran for hours, grounded in Torah, in halacha, and the deepest logic of Jewish law. And underneath it all, you could hear a man who understood that the people dying were not strangers. They were his people. And he believed with total clarity that the way Israel was fighting was going to keep getting them killed. One question drove everything he said on this. What does it actually take to end a war? His answer came from Deuteronomy. You shall lay siege to the city that is waging war against you until it is subdued. The sage Shammai reads these words as a legal standard. Until it is subdued. Maimonides codes it. The Rebbe applied it to every major Israeli military decision of his lifetime. You do not stop because you are tired. You do not stop because the international community is uncomfortable. You stop when the enemy is genuinely destroyed and cannot continue. And in the Rebbe's assessment, Israel had never reached that point. Instead, they always pulled back before it did, always at a cost that was paid by the next generation. The Rebbe also returned constantly to a story from the book of Malachim, Kings. King Achav defeats Ben-Hadad. God's prophet tells him the victory is coming, and it comes. And then Ben-Hadad's servants arrive in sackcloth. We surrender, they say, be merciful. Achab calls him his brother, makes a trade deal, sends him home. And then 3 years later, Ben-Hadad attacks again, and Achav is killed. The Rebbe's reading is not that mercy is wrong. It's that mercy extended to our enemies who hate us, who have not actually changed, is not mercy. It's a payment plan for the next war. My guest today is Rabbi Elisha Pearl, a writer and researcher at Sichos in English with rabbinic ordination and graduate training in philosophy and psychology. He has spent years building a book out of his argument. It's called Make Peace, and it's about to come out in Hebrew, which is great. This conversation belongs in Hebrew, in the Knesset and in the yeshivas and in the living rooms where parents are watching their kids go to war. Today we will discuss how for nearly half a century, one rabbi in Brooklyn had Israeli prime ministers making pilgrimage to his office. Menachem Begin, Golda Meir, Sharon, Rabin, Shazar, Shimon Peres, and Benjamin Netanyahu, leaders across the political spectrum, all seeking counsel from a man who never once set foot in Israel himself. That was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. He warned against trading land for peace decades before Oslo. He said Israel should never wait for Washington or the UN's approval before defending itself. He insisted that half measures don't create safety, they just guarantee the next round of violence. And through it all, he reminded us over and over that Eretz Yisrael, the claim to the land of Israel, is something older and way, way longer lasting than any modern treaty. God's covenant going back to the beginning of creation itself. Today, 32 years after his passing, his words are back in circulation. Bibi Netanyahu's been photographed with them. A new book called Make Peace in Hebrew now is trying to distill his teachings into a strategic playbook for today. So today we're going to ask, what did the Rebbe actually say about Israel, and is any of it still usable in 2026? Rabbi Elisha Pearl, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Chanale. I really appreciate you having me. And
so great to be here. Wonderful. Okay, so this book has been on the market for a number of years.
2 years at this point.
2 years. So I went Shabbos. We're going to put a link in our show notes so people can pick it up, order it on Amazon, I imagine. I was Shabbos by Daniel Fordham.
Old fellow man from Yeshiva.
Oh, terrific guy. We were going through this, and I said, where does Elisha Pearl live? He said, here in Eretz Yisrael. The book's coming out in Hebrew. I said, he's the guy for this conversation. So let's jump right in.
Sure.
The Rebbe tracked Israel's wars with a precision that surprised, generals and everyone. Right, exactly. He did maps and the terrain, and he knew the details. Let's break it down. Let's go back to the brass tacks. What was the Rebbe's, what was driving this? What did the Rebbe understand about Israel's security? Okay, and that other Torah leaders in that generation and in this generation don't understand.
Okay, so fascinating question, and I think that to explain that question, we need to ask what was so special about the Rebbe, and also why was it the case that so many Israeli prime ministers and generals were coming to the Rebbe and not to others, right? And I think that perhaps the way we should look at it is not to malign or neglect other leaders, but define what was it that was so special about the Rebbe as an individual, and why it's probably the case that when we look at the annals of Jewish history, the Rebbe will probably be remembered as somebody who's as influential as the Rambam, as Rav Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, as Moshe Rabbeinu himself, or as the biblical leaders. And I think in general, when we look at history from the time that we're in, it can be difficult to see the big picture. But if we project forward, we can probably imagine that the Rebbe will be remembered as the most significant leader of Judaism in the 20th century.
Right. It feels like in the past, but when you're living here, the Rebbe's, you could say his prophecy, his Ruach HaKodesh, his view for the future, it's as relevant today, if not more than
100%,
ever.
100%, right. for sure. I think you're mentioning it's 32 years since Gimel Tammuz, since the Rebbe's passing. And with each passing year, we see that the Rebbe's influence grows greater and greater, right? So to your question, what was so unique about the Rebbe? And I think the Rebbe's uniqueness is not limited to what the Rebbe had to say about Eretz Yisrael, right? His uniqueness is much broader, right? But then we can apply it specifically to Eretz Yisrael, right? So first of all, the Rebbe was a consummate knower of the Jewish tradition, right? Meaning he knew, he had at his fingertips the entire Jewish tradition, whether it was the Hebrew Bible Tanakh, whether it was the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, all of Kabbalah, all of Hasidic literature. And then, this is probably not a very well-known fact, but the Rebbe had a tremendously vast secular library, which he read. You can go to Crown Heights and see it yourself.
He went to university
as well.
He had an engineering degree.
Exactly. He studied philosophy, physics. Right. So on the one hand, he was a consummate knower of the Jewish tradition. Right. But on the other hand, he was very much a man of the world, a cosmopolitan man. Right. He spoke 6 languages.
I would say the Rebbe was the ultimate progressive. Ironically,
in a certain sense, how would you define that? How would you?
Just the way the Rebbe's vision of the world, to move it forward, to break ground, and the Rebbe was bold and brazen, and the Rebbe wasn't someone stuck in the old ways. He saw the modern world and wanted to. Look at the hookup room that existed way before the internet in 770. The Rebbe was streaming the Farbrengens around the world before people knew what the internet was.
100%. But I think what gives the Rebbe his staying power is the fascinating synthesis between traditionalism on the one hand, conservatism on the one hand, and pragmatism on the other, which is a certain paradox. Fine. So the Rebbe on the one hand was a consummate knower of the Jewish tradition. He was also very educated and a cosmopolitan man. Well, let's say if we look at other great leaders, right? So let's to give an example, you have, let's say, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik of Yeshiva University. And it happens to be that you look at, there were prime ministers who went to Rav Soloveitchik as well, right? But
Rav Kook also spoke.
Rav Kook, for sure. Although the Rav Kook that most of us know about passed away before the founding of the Medina, and then his son, the younger Rav Kook, was, let's say, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, right, was much more of a niche individual, right, who was incredibly influential for starting the settler movement, particularly in the Shomron, right, but was less of a world historical individual as was the Rebbe. But let's look for a moment at Rav Soloveitchik. Right, Rav Soloveitchik as well, right, was a tremendous knower of the Jewish tradition and an incredibly cosmopolitan man, right. But I think one thing about which was unique about the Rebbe was somebody who wanted to make himself accessible to everyone, who was interested in talking to everyone for hours and hours and hours. Even though the Rebbe was able to articulate the most sophisticated messages, and in fact did so with great complexity, he also understood that to reach the masses, to reach individuals, you also have to give over deep ideas in a simple way, right? So I would say, to summarize, what really made the Rebbe so unique was, first of all, his consummate knowledge of the Jewish tradition, right? His cosmopolitan character, but not only that, the fact that he was interested in talking and speaking and engaging with everyone, and also articulating messages in the most complex register as well as the simplest register. And for that reason, you see that the Rebbe was not only talking to generals and to prime ministers and people in government, he was also talking to the Chayal Pashut, the simple soldier, the Nifga'ei Tzahal, those who were wounded in the IDF, and the Rebbe really spoke to everyone. And I think that's a very large part of what gives the Rebbe his uniqueness and his staying power.
Yeah, and the Rebbe reached out in this message. It wasn't that the politicians, they came to 770. The Rebbe was a big tzaddik, reverence, and as a spiritual leader as well. But they respected his input, you're saying, on the actual technicalities. For sure.
And I think what's really fascinating is if you look, let's say, Menachem Begin, right before the Camp David Accords, right? Menachem Begin went to meet the Rebbe, right, to seek the Rebbe's counsel before Camp David, right? Or when Shazar would come to New York, right, he would not expect the Rebbe to come to him to his hotel, but rather he himself and would go visit the Rebbe in a certain sense.
Many hours in Yechidus.
For sure.
Not short meetings. We're talking about hours.
For sure. Menachem Begin was there for a long time. Meaning, Bechlal, you look at, all these prime ministers, meaning even though you're correct that the Rebbe did reach out, on the other hand, all these characters themselves were making the pilgrimages to the Rebbe. It wasn't
because
that the Rebbe was
they knew that the Rebbe had an agenda, and they wanted to know the Rebbe's agenda, and many of them put the Rebbe's advice into place. Many didn't, and that's why we're here today. One of the things I remembered as a child was that the Rebbe was anguished about the matzav. The Rebbe was pained. The Rebbe cried about it. Obviously, the Rebbe cried about Mashiach not being here and the prophecy not being revealed. But watching in real time the destruction and the piguim and the terrorist attacks, and I wouldn't say the Rebbe was helpless, but the message came very much across that this was something deeply personal. And the Hasidim, it's recorded over and over in the Sichos. The risk, the actual physical risks that the soldiers were in, that the
citizens of Israel,
the citizens of Israel in it, because we weren't securing our borders properly, and we were not providing a strong enough deterrence to our enemies, which is so important. Speak a little bit about the pain that the Hasidim witnessed, and why do you think that for our audience? As a Hasid, I know why the Eretz Yisrael was so important, but for someone who spent all of his lifetime growing Hasidus in America, that was technically the Chabad brand, you would say. The Rebbe spent a significant amount of time speaking about Israel. One would say his heart, his soul was here, in a sense. It was one of the biggest issues. So speak a little bit about the pain the Rebbe felt, and how did we get here? The Rebbe was so clear. Right? How did we get here? Why did our politicians not take the Rebbe seriously?
Okay, so great questions. I think it's really two questions. Like number one,
it mattered so much to him, right?
Or like really three, right? Number one, how do we see that it mattered so much to the Rebbe? Number two, why did it matter so much to the Rebbe? Number three, why didn't it impact the politicians?
Okay,
cool.
So clear.
So fine. So if you look at the Rebbe's talks in general, you see that the Rebbe, when he was talking about anything, would speak with tremendous passion and tremendous charisma, tremendous emotion. Right, the Rebbe's talks are not dry intellectual conversations. Right, meaning even let's say when the Rebbe would talk about, let's say, Chorban Beis Hamikdash, or would talk about the Chorban of the Holocaust, you'd see the Rebbe cry as well. But there's no question that if you listen or watch the sichos that the Rebbe would say on Eretz Yisrael, you see that there is a certain greater intensity in the Rebbe's emotional register And even for those sichas and farbrengens that were given on Shabbos, very often in the footnotes you'll see, and here the Rebbe cried, right? So meaning clearly Eretz Yisrael touched the Rebbe's heart very, very much. And many of the chosrim, many of the people who wrote up the Rebbe Sichos and Maimarim are still alive today. You can talk to them and they'll tell you, or even let's say simple chassidim who are by the Farbrengens will tell you that when the Rebbe spoke at a Farbrengen, it was clearly something that touched the Rebbe's heart very much. Right? I guess the question is, why is that? Right? So you mentioned the Rebbe was in America, right, and that was building a chassidus in America, and there is definitely something to that, right? And there's some scholars who would tell you that Chabad in the 20th/21st century is an American chassidus, but I really don't think that the Rebbe saw it that way. I think fundamentally the Rebbe saw himself as the Nasi Hadar, as the leader of the generation, or perhaps using the Rebbe's more humble register as an extension of his father-in-law, who he saw as the Nasi Hadar, as the leader of the generation, right? And Tanya Perek Beis talks about the idea of a Rebbe as a sort of collective consciousness, as somebody who contains the souls of all of Klal Yisrael. So the Rebbe took it very, very seriously. He truly believed that he had the responsibility to be a leader for Klal Yisrael. Now, that did not only extend to his chassidim, it did not only extend to Jews in America, it extended to Jews worldwide.
The Rebbe used to send emissaries here.
For sure, to Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, but meaning, the Rebbe sent emissaries to Morocco. The Rebbe was very, very heavily...
It was a big priority here in the 60s and 70s. That
For sure.
When people were making the first waves of Aliyah, that Chabad would be established here.
100%. Not just establishing Chabad, having an influence in Eretz Yisrael.
Sure.
Right? I mean, the Rebbe was also very, very influential in the former Soviet Union, throughout the entirety of his leadership.
Campaigns were here.
For sure.
Brooklyn, right?
Yeah, meaning they were also in Brooklyn,
right.
But they were inaugurated with respect to Eretz Yisrael, right? So meaning, and look, even let's say in the 1950s, you have David Ben Gurion writing to the Rebbe, seeking the Rebbe's counsel as a leader of the Jewish people, but the Rebbe felt very, very much that what was going on in the Jewish world, or the life of every Jew, was his responsibility. Now, so that extended to Eretz Yisrael, right? So therefore, the Rebbe cared very, very deeply about the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. But moreover, I think the Rebbe definitely felt that Eretz Yisrael had a certain pride of place in his world, and I think we could say on an even deeper level, the Rebbe saw the aftermath of the Holocaust and the new Western world as something that created a Messianic potential. And the Rebbe saw, in a very literal and real sense, not in a mythological sense, but in a real sense, he saw Mashiach at the doorstep. The Rebbe saw tremendous Messianic potential in the state of Israel, so therefore he cared very, very much that the state of Israel would move in a positive direction, and this experiment would be a successful one. Moreover, I think more than anything, is the Rebbe saw the precariousness of the state of the Jews in the state of Israel, and without any reference to it being Israel or Messianic prophecy or anything like that, the Rebbe just cared very, very deeply about the lives of Jews, and the fact that Jews were being killed, or Jews were at risk, was something that pained the Rebbe very, very much.
Wow. And when the Rebbe sat with these politicians and sat with the prime minister and sat with Bibi a number of times, obviously the Rebbe was very articulate and was able to express this and make it very clear. Do you think there was some sort of spiritual blockage or reason that time after time, and again, we have intelligent prime ministers, and I have respect for Bibi Netanyahu and for the things that he does that I feel are in line with the way I think Eretz Yisrael should be functioning as the line of the Jewish people. Do you feel like there was a spirit there? I mean, I want to talk about the big picture, then we'll talk about the details, but do you feel like there was a spiritual blockage? I'm sure the Hasidim would be excited when a prime minister would come speak to the Rebbe, and they would say, this time he's going to go back and he's going to put the law into place, and we're going to make some changes, and finally we're not going to repeat the same mistakes over and over. And then we all sat here twiddling our thumbs and watched this agreement and that politician and this Arab and whatever. Things didn't fall into place like we thought they would.
Sure. Okay. So I think it's instructive to consider why it is that these prime ministers were reaching out to the Rebbe to begin with, and we could try to model the world from which they came from, then understand why they may or may not have listened to the Rebbe. Now, there could definitely be some spiritual explanation, but I think there are probably simpler explanations we could give, right? So let's take David Ben Gurion, right? So David Ben Gurion wrote a letter to the Rebbe in the 50s, right? Didn't follow the Rebbe's advice, right? Why did he write the letter to the Rebbe to begin with? Presumably because he wanted either to get some degree of consensus or show that he was taking the opinions of religious leaders seriously. But at the end of the day, he had very secularist values, right? So he didn't necessarily feel that he needed to follow the Rebbe's advice. But then let's take another example, which was Menachem Begin, right? Now, Menachem Begin is very different than David Ben Gurion because Menachem Begin would be, let's say, the first prime minister who we could view as, religious adjacent. And right before Camp David, Menachem Begin came to visit the Rebbe, right? And he came to ask for the Rebbe's counsel, right? He even told the American media that I forget the exact quote, but the Rebbe's a great leader, something along the lines of a prophet in Israel, and it's really important to seek his advice, right? And the Rebbe spoke very strongly about the idea that we should not give back the Sinai Desert. Right.
We should not give back any land.
Any land.
Right.
But at that time,
Mm-hmm.
was on the table was the Sinai Desert, right? So the Rebbe spoke very, very strongly about giving back the Sinai. And the Rebbe also spoke very strongly against conceding to Palestinian autonomy, right? And the Palestinian autonomy agreement in Camp David is ultimately the forebearer of Oslo, right? And one could say, in a certain sense, the forebearer of October 7th and many negative things, right? So in a certain sense, the Rebbe saw, and even let's say not only in a prophetic sense, but in a military strategic sense, the Rebbe predicted what could go wrong with this seemingly innocuous or seemingly benign agreement, right? And Menachem Begin sat by the Rebbe, right? And the Rebbe explained to him, don't do this, right? Don't concede. But then you have to consider Menachem Begin went to sit with Jimmy Carter, right? At Camp David. When you're sitting with the President of the United States and the President of the United States is threatening you, that I'm not going to give you millions of dollars in aid, your country is going to collapse, and you're going to have to go and beg for planes, from third world countries, right? That's very, very hard.
We see now people argue that Trump and Bibi also have this, unhealthy relationship, and that we get, there's like we keep getting swindled or we keep getting sold something as Israelis, and then when they, our politicians go to Washington, things change. So sure. I understand. Yeah, people say all the time, things look very different from the prime minister's
Exactly. Meaning, Ariel Sharon actually said that, before the disengagement from Gaza, people asked him, Ariel Sharon, weren't you once the champion of taking over Gaza?
Right. I read his book and I was rallying him all the way. I'm like, where did things go so wrong?
Right.
Yeah. And what did he say?
And he said, things look very different from here than they do from there.
So that's what you're saying. So they would go to the Rebbe and they would obviously come away reassured that this is the right way to do things, because it seems very black and white. You can't trust the Arabs. None of these agreements are going to be lasting because they're going to pull one over us anyways. Mm-hmm. But you're saying as politicians, they have other things to consider.
I wouldn't even say other things to consider. I mean to say, I think that the Rebbe made very strong strategic arguments, right? But when you're in that place, right, and you're sitting with theoretically speaking, the most powerful man in the world and the most powerful country in the world,
you can't say
right?
what my Rebbe said.
No. You can, but I would say psychologically, I've never been there, but psychologically, I can imagine that it's very, very hard to follow the Rebbe's advice. I mean, in a certain sense, like we could look back to the biblical story of Shaul HaMelech, right, where Shaul, King Saul, goes wrong, right, and loses the kingship, right. Shmuel Hanavi, right, the prophet Samuel gives Shaul HaMelech advice, right, tells him what to do, right, and
kill every last one, every mother, women, children, animals,
sure, all of them, among other things, right. For example, wait for me to bring the sacrifice, right, which is a little bit less of an intense command than kill the sheep, right? But be that as it may, right? Shaul HaMelech loses the kingship because he doesn't have faith in God's prophet, right? So in a certain sense, you could say that Shaul's decisions made rational sense. There was a space from which the things he decided to do made sense
as a king. Let's say from his position as a king,
for sure, right? So meaning in a similar sense, or one could say that from a political perspective, the pressure on, or psychological perspective, the pressure on Begin was very, very strong. We could understand why he made the decision, right? But meaning perhaps, and again, we can't judge him because we weren't sitting in his chair, right? But perhaps the right thing for him to have done would have been to have faith in God's prophet, in the Rebbe's advice, and go ahead and follow the Rebbe's advice. And then we'd probably be in a much better state. Did
the Rebbe speak about our relationship with the American government and our reliance on their funding and on the weapons and all that?
Yes.
And what did the Rebbe feel? Sure.
Okay. So the Rebbe spoke about this at great length, and I think there are many, many threads in this conversation, right?
The Rebbe felt very strongly about the allies and the relationship should be healthy and respectful. And I mean, the Rebbe never dragged down on America and never called out the politicians publicly or the president. I mean, the Rebbe wanted that we should have that healthy relationship. And I think, I'm just saying, I'm trying to remember when I was growing up, when we heard about the Rebbe speaking about Eretz Yisrael and these issues. In one sense, like there was this tremendous hope that the politicians would follow the Rebbe's instructions and so on. But I just remember being disappointed all over and over again. But there was only, right, but we weren't but the Rebbe wasn't in the political sphere. I mean, the Rebbe didn't have the power to put the laws into, he could only speak to the people's neshamas and to their seichel, and the rest was, I guess, up to them and the pressures that they faced.
Sure. So your question is, what was the Rebbe's take on the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Sure. So I think the Rebbe had a very, very multivariate take on the Israel-America relationship. Right. So first of all, the Rebbe, broadly speaking, had a very, very positive view on America. Right. The Rebbe looked at America as a Medina shel Chesed, right, as a country of kindness. The Rebbe was very impressed by the founding fathers. He was very impressed by the United States as a democracy. He was very impressed by America being founded on principles of faith and kindness. And the Rebbe believed that America had tremendous, tremendous potential as a country in general. Now, with respect to the U.S.-Israel relationship, I think there are several points that are worth considering. Number one is the Rebbe noted that Israel is in fact a very vulnerable country, right? We have people today who speak about Israel being so strong and being so macho, and you even have these people in the Knesset, right? And they'll go and say, we don't have to rely on America at all, right? And the Rebbe, I think, had a much more, and this I think typifies the Rebbe's perspective in general. The Rebbe had a very realistic perspective, and the Rebbe was, in addition to being a man of the spirit, the Rebbe was also a man of realpolitik, right? And he said that Israel is in fact very vulnerable, right? The Rebbe actually wrote in a letter in 1968 to some students in a youth village who had written to him, right? The Rebbe wrote that al pi derech hateva, based on the laws of nature, Israel should not be able to exist, right? And in fact, Israel is dependent on American aid, right? That said, I think there were a few principles the Rebbe thought which would be helpful in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Number one is that the Rebbe thought that Israel should diversify, that it should not only be dependent on the U.S., but should develop relationships with other countries.
The Rebbe would have loved the Abraham Accords.
Potentially. So, meaning if you actually look at some of Rabbi Elkanah Shmutkin of GEM, has been working on the Rebbe's views on Israel for how many decades at this point? Probably close to 3 decades, right? So he has some questions about the Abraham Accords. I think, and the Abraham Accords, there's plenty to discuss there, right? But be as it may, right? The Rebbe definitely believed in diversifying. So so it could be the Abraham Accords, right? The Rebbe actually did have some difficulties with the ways that countries are run in the Middle East. But the Rebbe mentioned Germany, he mentioned the Netherlands, believe it or not, he even mentioned China as potential allies for Israel, right? In order for Israel to diversify, right? He even noted that Egypt was, not only taking money from America, but was also taking money from Russia. So he suggested that perhaps if Israel will diversify, then it would be taken more seriously as an ally. But then I think another thing that the Rebbe observed with respect to American demands is a few things. Number one, the Rebbe said that the United States unlike many think, is not a monolith, right? Meaning to say that administrations change, right? So you can weather out policies in a hard administration and then work with a more friendly administration. But then in a given administration itself, right, the Rebbe noted, right, that there are many, many different players, right? There's a Secretary of State who has his agenda. There's a president who has his agenda. And you want to work with the people in the government who are your allies and try to sideline those who are not your allies, right? But then I think two more points which are very relevant. The Rebbe thought that very often American demands are performative, right? So America will say, don't do this, right? Because that's what they need to say politically, right? But Israel can go ahead and do it and America will be okay.
Yeah, we've seen that over and over in the last 2 years.
Sure, 100%, right? I mean, like, a great example would be, let's say, the bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, right? Where at the time, America withheld F-16 jets from the United States, and there was public condemnation. But we see later, and then the Rebbe said right after, that America is actually pretty happy. And we see actually that Ronald Reagan wrote in his journals, which were only revealed years later, that Ronald Reagan thought it was a good idea, right? And the Rebbe noted as well, even though America will threaten not to give us weapons, ultimately they'll be happy when we do what we need to do, and they'll give us even more weapons. So ultimately the F-16s did come. But perhaps the most fundamental point is that the Rebbe thought that the way which others relate to us, the way in which others relate to us, is ultimately a function of our self-perception. And he thought that in a certain sense, the cardinal sin of the Jewish people, the cardinal sin of the Israeli government, is that the Israeli government is always looking down at itself, or is always trying to be like the Goyim, trying to imitate the Goyim, as opposed to having Jewish pride. And the Rebbe quoted the story of the Meraglim, of the spies who came to Israel and said, we can't overtake Israel because they're too strong, right? And the issue, right, with the spies was, they said, we were as grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we were in their eyes. Right? And the Rebbe said, if you see yourself as a grasshopper, right, then you'll be taken as a grasshopper. Whereas the two spies who said that we should in fact conquer Israel said, God is with us. Right, so the Rebbe's approach was, if you have the approach that God is with us, then the nations of the world, particularly in the United States, will respect you. That's
why the Rebbe was the perfect conduit for this message, because the Rebbe spoke so much theologically about the importance of the land and our connection to the land and our pride, and how it was also, I think those were lost in the details when you sit in these political offices and you go over these contracts and deals. Like, nobody's really talking about the fact of the matter. Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jewish people. Everything just becomes so wordy, and everyone's trying to, cut their own, get something benefits them from this agreement. But the Rebbe hacked it in our heads over and over. Although one will argue, the Rebbe wasn't your typical Zionist per se. The Rebbe didn't believe in a secular Israel state that should be like Europe, chas v'shalom. If anything, the Rebbe argued about Aliyah and who is a Jew and the sanctity of the land. So that's, I think, why the Rebbe's messages landed so well, because he harped upon this issue that Eretz Yisrael is a spiritual inheritance, and at the same time, I mean, let's talk tachlis. Technically, it doesn't make sense to leave borders open and to make agreements with Arabs who want us to kill us.
For sure.
Right.
There's definitely that synthesis in there.
Yeah. So that's why this is such an emotional conversation. I want to ask you more, though, about the issue of Zionism, because for a lot of people, for many years as a Lubavitcher, we were taught, or we were raised not necessarily singing, not at all, singing Hatikva in school. We didn't have Israeli flags in Cheder or in Beis Rivka or wherever it was. But that's not to say, but one could argue that the Lubavitchers are the biggest Zionists, because the Rebbe was, in fact, as we're discussing now, I mean, his whole life was about making this everlasting peace in Eretz Yisrael, and he wanted that to see it in his lifetime. So what is it about Zionism? Okay, I want to just kind of put it away once and for all, that you would say is not the Rebbe's style. And what was it about Zionism that would you say that was exactly what the Rebbe, is in line with what the Rebbe spoke about? And can I essentially be, as a Lubavitcher, a proud Zionist? Am I a Haredi Zionist? Am I a Chabad Zionist? So I was saying, just want to make it clear, the reason we didn't sing Hatikva is because the Rebbe spoke about how it didn't have a reference to Hashem, to the Creator, and it almost implies that the land just was given to us by the Chilutzim and the pioneers, and it wasn't a spiritual inheritance. But again, I don't know. I don't know why we didn't have you celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut as kids.
Sure. Okay. So you're asking, would we characterize the Rebbe as a Zionist,
Yes.
right? So I'll tell you
because up until now it sounds like yes, the Rebbe was a Zionist. I mean, where is he not a Zionist?
Sure. So I'll give you an academic line, right, and then we'll maybe launch into the discussion more deeply, right? So if we wanted to be academics, we might call the Rebbe a post-nationalist ultra-Zionist.
Post-nationalist ultra-Zionist.
Yes,
okay.
Post-nationalist ultra-Zionist. But let's go ahead and define what that means, right? So in general, when we think about Zionism in the state of Israel, right? Very often we start thinking about these things from, the earliest we can remember from when we were born, right? But really the whole discussion of Zionism is really something that goes back to, the late 1800s with Theodor Herzl, right? And Theodor Herzl starts the Zionist Congress, right? Theodor Herzl had a lot of ideas. The first one was, let's all convert to Christianity to get rid of anti-Semitism. Then perhaps let's move to Uganda, right? And then ultimately it's like, let's move to Israel. Now, if you consider the religious landscape in Eastern and Western Europe, at the turn of the 20th century, right? What you really have is a tremendous degree of attrition from Jewish communities. Young people are leaving religion left and right. And where are they going? They're generally going either towards secularist materialism, or they're getting excited by Marxism, communism, socialism.
Everybody wants an ism.
Exactly right. I mean, it was definitely the age of the isms, right? And I think if you look at youth again around the turn of the 20th century, there was a much greater idealism, right, than there is around the turn of the 21st century, which maybe we'll get to a little bit later in terms of one of the Rebbe's major social critiques. But be that as it may, right, if you're looking at the nascent state of Israel in the late 1800s or early 1900s, right, you see Zionism as basically an escape from Judaism and yet another utopian assimilationist movement, right? Meaning, if you're a religious leader, you don't want your kids, or even a parent, you don't want your kids to become Zionists because being a Zionist means I'm going to stop eating kosher food.
Yeah, right? We've had guests here who their first experience was on a kibbutz in Israel where they didn't even know that Yom Kippur came and went. Sure.
Meaning, great story actually. There's a Russian refusenik who I often eat by here in Jerusalem, and he mentioned that his grandmother went to a kibbutz and she saw a picture of Joseph Stalin hanging in the kibbutz dining room. So it wasn't a picture of Theodor Herzl, it was a picture of the Rebbe, it was a picture of Joseph Stalin. All of a shalom. Wow. Yes. So it definitely speaks to the ideology that, let's say, religious leaders in the late 1800s, early 1900s were really not happy with, and that's why they didn't like Zionism. Zionism meant you're going to move to the nascent state of Israel and you're going to become a secularist farmer who's trying to create a secularist nation state socialist. For Jews. Yeah, socialist. But meaning, I think that the issue was less with socialism and more secularism and casting off Torah and mitzvahs, casting off the Jewish tradition.
But I always didn't understand that. How do you lay claim to a land if you don't have any spiritual connection? If there's no religion, if you don't believe in the Bible, then why don't you move to Uganda? And how are you actually going to defend this land, you little Israeli, with your
pitchfork.
With your pitchfork from all these enemies? So I'm trying to. So where was that? I mean, I would say it's, first of all, it's subconscious, and it's just a natural thing that I think every Israeli deep down knows that this land belongs to him, and he'll argue it, and it'll till his last breath. I am a Jew and this is my land. And we saw what happened on October 7th. We saw the leftists on the border who thought that, we're all the same. Let me drive your kids to the hospital, and and maybe you'll like us. We saw where that ended up.
Right.
So, yeah.
No, so that's definitely an excellent question. I just want to get back a little bit to the Zionism conversation, right? Okay, so meaning that was the issue, right, with Zionism, right? But then if we look at, and that's why, by the way, the Rebbe's one of the Rebbe's predecessors, the fifth Rebbe of Lubavitch, right, wrote a lot of things against the Zionist movement. We need to take them in context to remember what it is that he took issue with, right? It wasn't with Jews moving to Israel, right, but rather it was replacing Judaism with
Zionism,
socialism, right? Meaning, to quote the title of the Satmar Rebbe's book, Al Hagulav Al Hatmura, right, on redemption and on its exchange, right? That there's the Jewish picture of redemption, and we're exchanging it with something else, right? We'll explain in a second why the Rebbe didn't agree with the Satmar Rebbe on Eretz Yisrael. But be as it may, I think we should remember that at the same time that the Rebbe Rashab was, not a fan of the Zionist movement, the Rebbe Rashab was sending people to Eretz Yisrael. He was starting yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael. He was building yeshuvim in Eretz Yisrael, right? And then, if we look at the Chabad movement in general, the Chabad movement or the Hasidic movement, right, very much believed in Jews moving to Israel. And some of the first Jewish pioneers from Eastern Europe were the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov and for that matter, the disciples of the Gra, right? So who were religious Jews, right? And then even in Tanya, the masterwork of Chabad Hasidus, you see in the fourth section, the Alter Rebbe is writing in every other letter, give money to Eretz Yisrael, support the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. The Alter Rebbe even went to jail, exactly, over giving money to Eretz Yisrael, and the Mittler Rebbe too, the second Rebbe Lubavitch, right? So meaning Lubavitch was always into
Palestine,
the idea, exactly, but meaning for the Alter Rebbe doesn't write Palestine, he writes Eretz Yisrael, right? But be that as it may, right? So we see that Yishuv of Eretz Yisrael, right, settling the land of Israel, was something that was very, very close to the hearts of the Chabad Rebbeim. But fine, so we have this breakdown, right, this anti-Zionism, right, in the, let's say, early 20th century, right, as a result of Zionism replacing Judaism, right? But then there are some cataclysmic events, right? And the major cataclysmic event would be really what one could say, the rise of the Soviet Union, but more intensely, the Holocaust, right? To the point that by the 1940s, the Friedrich Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe's successor, right, already has a very different perspective on the Zionists, right? To the extent that in a Sechel the Friedrich Rebbe wrote in 1947, mere months before the founding of the State of Israel, right? The Friedrich Rebbe says, in Eretz Yisrael, there are Jews who are living on Mesiras Nefesh, who are living with a perspective of self-sacrifice. And he says it's true that they don't necessarily eat kosher food, and they have to fix up.
But he still saw the value.
Oh, for sure, 100%. And he's like, we really, it would be nice if they did some more Torah mitzvahs.
Sure, that's the whole mentality of Lubavitch, though. Mm-hmm. We put tefillin on people who could have eaten chazer treif an hour ago because their avera doesn't make them intrinsically lesser of value.
100%. But what's interesting
people
is
argue that it does.
Oh, for sure. But I'm saying what's interesting about the Sikha of the Friedrich Rebbe is not, it's so sad. There are people who are not keeping Torah mitzvahs. The main thing was, no. There are Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael and they're engaging in Mesiras Nefesh. They're engaging in self-sacrifice. And everybody, the Friedrich Rebbe says there, right, without, irrespective of the religious party they come from, right, should tell them, Yasher Kayach, they're doing a good job, right? And his point about them not keeping Torah.
In and of itself?
Not only the element of the mitzvah, but meaning the element of sacrifice for the Jewish people, and they're building a homeland for the Jewish people, right? So now getting to the Rebbe, right? The Rebbe saw the founding of the contemporary state of Israel as, first of all, an act of God, right? Meaning that he saw it as a gift that God gave to the Jewish people. Right now, that certainly sounds very Zionistic.
But the Rebbe didn't feel that Mashiach had arrived.
Certainly not. No.
Okay.
Yes.
Which is also a Zionistic concept.
Okay. Meaning
it's that said that we're at the beginning of the Messianic era, and that we have to lay claim to the land and show God that we're here, and technically and physically build the temple.
Okay, yes. So the Rebbe thought the temple should be built on Mashiach.
Right, Mashiach has to arrive, right?
Right.
Okay.
But meaning he did see, right, the contemporary state of Israel as, God giving us the state of Israel, and he also saw it as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So then where does it come from that, let's say in Chabad, we don't say Hal on Yom Ha'atzmaut, we don't wave the Israeli flag in official Chabad communication. Exactly.
Okay.
We don't call Israel Medinat Yisrael, but call it Eretz Yisrael. Right? Okay. So the Rebbe says actually explicitly in letters that he wrote to Shazar and to another politician named Gul Cohen, he said, "What's my issue with using the term Medinat Yisrael?" Right? The Rebbe said the term Medinat Yisrael indicates that there was, there was history, right? And then in 1948 there was a new entity called the State of Israel, which was founded, right? And the Rebbe said it's very important to me to say that this place that we're in, right, is not a new nation state that was founded in 1948. Right, but is rather a clear continuation of the biblical Jewish Commonwealth and the Jewish Commonwealth of Bayesheni. And for that reason, the messaging is incredibly, incredibly important, right? So, I'm not going to, stipulate, right, that it's a bad thing to say Hal on Yom Ha'atzmaut, and I understand why it is that people say Hal on Yom Ha'atzmaut, right? Why it is that people say Hal on Yom Yerushalayim, because, and certainly in religious Zionist circles, right, the idea of saying Hal on these days is very much, recognizing that Hashem did Nisim for us, right? And, you can see, many Gedolei Yisrael, many people with great Yiras Shamayim, who are saying Hallel and dancing with great vigor and joy on Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. So the question is then, why is it that people who are very closely following the Rebbe's spiritual path will themselves generally not be saying Hallel on these days, right? So I think for the Rebbe, there is a very, very big risk when you begin to blur the lines between the contemporary nation state and the Torah's perspective, the Torah's ideology. And I think that the Rebbe very often saw that, and I think if one just looks at the world, you see this to be true, that many in the religious Zionist world, by taking on the trappings of the state, began to blur the lines between what the Torah's ideology is and what the ideology of the state of Israel is, right? And if you stay away from, let's say, the trappings of the state, then you're able to occupy a space where you are an ambassador just of the Torah's perspective and not also being entrapped by elements of the state which are, let's say, less savory. Maybe to give an example, right? There is, I'm not going to mention the MB Shiva or the Rosh Hashiva for that matter, but there is a very well-known, influential religious Zionist yeshiva from which very significant religious books have come out of. I would say, perhaps most people who are studying for rabbinic ordination today are using books from this yeshiva. And there was a religious Zionist yeshiva, and they stopped saying Hal on Yom Ha'atzmaut after this engagement, right? And I think that the reason was there was a sort of loss of faith in Medinat Yisrael, in the secular state of Israel, as the vessel of God's will. And they said that by not saying Hal, we're saying that we have a different space or a different place in which we derive our values. So maybe to share another anecdote, there's a lot of tension today in Judea and Samaria about Jews owning Judea and Samaria. And once I traveled with a delegation of Chabad rabbis to a contested settlement, which was basically being held by a bunch of young yeshiva bachrim. And, we climbed the hill to get to this contested settlement. And when we get to the top of the hill, we see a flag. But it wasn't the Israeli flag. It was the Mashiach flag, right? And we asked them, what's up with the Mashiach flag, right? So they explained to us that, we don't want to be, in a secular state. We want Mashiach to come, right? And for them, Mashiach was not, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's, Mashiach himself, whoever he may be. Now, ironically, the next day, a unit of the Israeli army came and dismantled the settlement. Right? So that might explain why it is that many who are, let's say, very, very intensely believers in the Jewish people being in the state of Israel, to the extent that these young men are risking their lives to live on these hilltops and to conquer more land of Israel, right, see that the state of Israel is antithetical sometimes to advancing that agenda.
I mean, the Rebbe said he was unequivocally opposed to giving any land away. He said it's absolutely against the Shulchan Aruch. It's literally against the law. Anything, and all the negotiations, Yehuda and Shomron, and the Rebbe was clearly against it, strongly against it.
For sure.
But I mean, look, we don't have complete sovereignty on the heartland of Israel until today, unfortunately. And there were opportunities, but we gave them secular names and we gave other people claim to the land. And I know we see what's going on there. I want to speak about the UN a little bit, about our international relationships, because I worked for a while. I work in social media and I work in Middle East news, and everything that's going on around the world directly affects us, unfortunately, whether we want to or not. I remember they were saying that the UN is a den of wolves; they can't be trusted. I mean, what we see, it's a parody of itself. I mean, at this point, it's literally a parody of itself. Okay. At the same time, we represent. We have our representatives there. We defend Israel in the UN. We're a part of the UN. It hasn't been defunded yet, as much as we would appreciate that. What role does the UN play in Israel with in the decisions that Eretz Yisrael makes today, And do you think that Israel should have pulled out of the UN, or at this point just not pay attention? Although we saw what happened with the International Criminal Court. I mean, we were dragged in there kicking and screaming. Can we actually extricate ourselves from the international community permanently, like the Rebbe advised?
Okay, so I think anybody who observes the UN understands that the UN is an absolute
buffoonery.
Is a theater,
it's
right?
A theater,
and everyone understands that the UN is a theater. Of course. Meaning all these people who send delegates to the UN definitely understands the theater. I wonder if, let's say, the Secretary General of the UN has a self-awareness to realize that it's a theater. But meaning
the Rebbe said a den of wolves. It's more than a theater. It's dangerous.
For sure. Meaning, thank God the wolves are a little bit defanged in the UN, but yes, it's definitely a den of wolves, right? But and in general, the Rebbe's take on the UN was more to mock the UN than to say that it was dangerous, right? Maybe just to speak for a moment to the UN's inefficacy, and then I'll maybe speak to what I think is the real crux of the issue.
You could even go into, let's say, what South Africa's the ruling over there and the anti-Semites internationally, and how the Rebbe dealt with that, and how Eretz Yisrael, should we turn our nose at it? Should we pay attention to it? Should we be dealing with it? Should we be having our lawyers, fight it out in court? What did Rebbe feel? Sure.
Okay, so maybe just to share a little anecdote about the UN, right? And this is something that the Rebbe spoke about, right? There's a military organization called UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, right? And this interim force has been around since 1978. Right now we're in 2026, right? So interim means temporary, right? But it's been around for a lot longer than I've been alive, right? And in a certain sense, UNIFIL just has like a bunch of soldiers and they're hanging out there, but throughout all these years, there've been war after war after war, and they haven't done anything effective. So yeah, the UN is an incredibly ineffective institution, right? And the Rebbe said generally that we should not take the UN seriously.
Yeah, and not even consider it before we make decisions.
Right.
Yeah, they're irrelevant.
Right. Okay. The Rebbe said in terms of realpolitik, we should consider which countries actually matter. The opinion of the United States actually does matter. The opinion of the UN does not matter, right? But the Rebbe thought that there was, let's say, a much more fundamental issue, right? The Jewish tradition talks about the 70 nations, right? The Shivim Goyim, right? And one could say that the contemporary UN is perhaps a instantiation of those 70 nations, despite its absurdity, right? But that said, the Rebbe said what's often much more concerning than the external goy, what's much more concerning than the external non-Jew is Hagoy Asher Bekirbacha, right? Is the non-Jew within you, right? And the Rebbe's main issue with the UN was not the UN's pronouncements. The Rebbe took America's pronouncements very seriously, right? Or thought that, Russia and China were relevant, but did not think that the UN was relevant, right? But the Rebbe thought that the very significant issue was when we begin to think in their terms, right? When our ethics derive from the ethics of the UN, then we're in serious trouble.
They
right?
have ethics. They put the Iran on the women's a health committee or something. I mean,
right. So meaning the Rebbe's claim was that there are professed ethics, right? Meaning as the Rebbe put it quite vividly, there's what the preacher says in church on Sunday, right? So whether or not you actually follow what the preacher says in church on Sunday, the preacher says some stuff.
But what are their ethics? That Israel's the oppressor and Hamas are freedom fighters?
Okay, meaning so I'll give you let's say one example, right? And this is perhaps a controversial one. So the IDF has a principle called Torah Haneshek, right, which means purity of our weapons, right? And the long and short of Torah Haneshek means that we don't fight with non-competence, right? But that ultimately means, right, that young soldiers from the IDF are sacrificed on the altar of Gazans or sacrificed on the altar of our enemy.
Just to be clear, they won't shoot an innocent person and they will end up losing their lives.
Exactly. I mean, the question is also, what does an innocent person mean, right? The innocent person, right, might...
Somebody who's technically not Hamas, although everyone there, Alan Dershowitz will argue everyone there's a certain percentage that everyone's involved, and the percentage just varies from 30% to 50% to 100%.
Sure. I mean, let's say even you'll have, let's say someone who's dressed as a grandmother but is actually a terrorist, or, somebody who looks like an innocent child but is actually passing messages to terrorists.
All the reason to believe that most of the people in Gaza would like to kill our soldiers.
For sure. I mean,
of all ages.
They've done statistical surveys and they've seen that to be the case, right? But the point is that Torah HaNeshek, right, is not something which is imposed by the international community, right? It's something which is imposed by the leadership of the IDF, which is imposed by certain factors or certain factions in the Israeli government, right? So I think that the most significant takeaway with respect to the UN is, number one, don't take what they say seriously, right? Or don't take what the so-called international community says seriously, right? Don't, pay any attention to performative grandstanding, which doesn't mean, by the way, that you shouldn't engage with them.
None shouldn't go?
No, it doesn't mean you shouldn't engage with them. Meaning the Rebbe encouraged Bibi Netanyahu to stay as the ambassador at the UN because he felt there would be important messages to be shared, right? And, there's no question, right, that there are, people who are in the UN who will be positively influenced by hearing the Israeli ambassador. I mean, I'll say that I myself have gone to the UN, was invited by a Chabad rabbi there, and spoken with various characters there, right? So meaning there are definitely people who are interested in listening to what we have to say, but certainly not take it seriously. But I think the much more fundamental point is the question of where do our values come from, and the Rebbe felt that very often the values of the Israeli army's leadership, or the values of many factions of the Israeli government, are deriving from these hypocritical values, which are perhaps best exemplified by the UN, and instead we should be getting our values from the Torah, from the Code of Jewish Law.
We have our own script, right?
Exactly.
We don't have to borrow anything from there. This is an amazing book.
Thank you.
I'm halfway through. You went from a 12-page op-ed on Chabad.org to a 480-page book in a matter of months, okay? What is it about this whole matter that really convinced you that it's time to sit down to write this book, not just an article?
Mm-hmm.
And who is your target audience for this book?
Sure. Okay, that's a great question.
You can hold it up for our audience so people can see.
Yeah, so
there we is. English and Hebrew.
This is the book, right? Make Peace, and God willing, it'll be coming out in several weeks in Hebrew under the name Oseh Shalom. Okay, great. So this is actually interesting because we're transitioning from theological topics.
I have more questions,
okay.
But I want to get back to the book.
Sure.
Because I know this conversation we could talk for 4 hours. There's so much to get to, but when people read it, they'll really get the scope of what we're talking about here. So
sure, yeah. So to the personal narrative behind the story, right? So I was personally born in Brooklyn. And in the Chabad community there, and I think definitely from a young age, what was going on in the state of Israel was very, very relevant to the members of the Chabad community. I mean, I think, and we're speaking about the Rebbe and the Rebbe's views, and what the Rebbe gave to the Chabad community. So he didn't necessarily give us singing Hatikva or Halal Yom Ha'atzmaut, but he did give us a very, very intense feeling of connection to Eretz Yisrael, right? And that's why I think if you meet people from Chabad communities around the world, they may have never been to Israel, they may not have the financial means to come to Eretz Yisrael, right? But they feel so deeply connected to Israel. And, I've spoken to people in Israeli politics, and they say, when I go around to Chabad houses around the world, I'm so impressed by how even the young Bachrim are very often so deeply aware of all of Israel's wars and all the details, often more so than even some soldiers, some young soldiers in the IDF.
Yeah, because Rebbe spoke about it over and over. Sure,
exactly. But it then inspires them to start research even more. Right. So I mean that's the background I'm coming from. And then at the age of 18, through a interesting story of circumstances, I came to study at Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush Etzion. And living in Yehuda v'Shomron, I became very interested in what the Rebbe had to say about Shleimus Aretz. So at that point, about the integrity of the land of Israel. So at that point, I began studying the Rebbe's sichos on the topic. But I never imagined that I would write, on the topic, meaning I was writing about other things. And then October 7th happened. And at that time, I was living in Eretz Yisrael, as I am now, in Gush Etzion. And I think that, sometimes when you, in general, in some places in Israel, you might feel insulated from the conflict. I think that when you live in Yehuda v'Shomron and you can pass every day the space where the spot where the 3 boys were kidnapped from in 2014, or you're standing at the bus stop and you make sure to stand behind the bollards because a car might come and try to run you over if you don't, right? And you notice the soldiers standing there in the rain, right? And you understand why they're there. The conflict feels very, very visceral. But at least for me, I think October 7th was just, and I think really was for all of us as Jews, it was an incredibly traumatic experience.
Yeah.
And I felt that I had to try and articulate the Rebbe's view on the topic. And, originally the idea was that, Chabad has such a large global presence. But there's so many people around the world who are just so deeply uneducated about what goes on in Israel, right? And there are people who, let's say, are very sympathetic to Israel. Will come to a Chabad house, right? There might, I've even had the experience once of speaking to a professor in DC who's very, very sympathetic to Israel. So I asked him, what do you think the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict is? So he says, well, clearly Gaza is not working out. So I think we need to move the Palestinians from Gaza to Judea and Samaria. So I asked him, Professor, you're familiar with the topography of Judea and Samaria? He's like, no. So I explained the topography that Judea and Samaria are like hills which overlook, Tel Aviv. And he's like, oh, probably not a great idea, right? But the point being that even people who are very sympathetic to Israel are very often deeply uneducated, right, about what's going on. So the original idea behind the op-ed, right, was to just educate these people who are sympathetic to Israel, to educate our base, to understand, what's not working, right? What should be done from a military perspective, right? And then, what are the Rebbe's broader views in terms of how we can, resolve or at least ameliorate to some extent this conflict and save more Jewish lives, right? So that was the intended target audience of the book. And really, I did not expect this, but thank God it got around in America. Charlie Kirk, Olav Shalom, had a copy. Bibi has a copy in his office. We're not sure if he read it, but at least he has a copy. So thank God that's the story behind the book.
That's amazing. I like it because you talk tachlis, like the technical details, so people could really get the full picture of what the Rebbe spoke about. We also speak about the spirituality of it, how the Rebbe spoke that the weapons that we have are, tefillin. I know my grandfather, Leibel Muchkin, came here during the expulsion of Gush Katif to do two things. Number one, to encourage the mitnachalim, or the residents of Gaza, that they could leave besimcha and everything's going to be okay, even though they were schlepped out of their houses kicking and screaming. And also to put tefillin on the soldiers. He was here during the Lebanon War and he put tefillin on the soldiers then. So we know that the idea of that the Torah and the mitzvahs and Jewish identity are so much tied into Israel's security infrastructure, okay? But how do we make that argument to a modern secular Israeli in 2026 who might not live on a kibbutz and not keep Yom Kippur, but the thought of, some Rebbe in Crown Heights giving advice to Bibi, who he probably hates anyway because the left here hates Bibi. It just seems so far-fetched. So I guess what I want to say is Bibi has the book. If the Rebbe was sitting in front of Bibi now, what would Bibi say? What would the Rebbe say besides read the book? What is the actual message that you think could resound across the whole political spectrum here in Israel? Because the Rebbe had that capability.
Sure. Okay, so I'd like to answer the first question first, right? Which is, how would I articulate these ideas to a secular Israeli
Jew?
Right.
Yes.
Sure. So I think it's interesting that if we let's say we go back in history, right, to let's say 1978, right, or really even 1992 for that matter, which is when the Rebbe stopped publicly speaking on these matters. It would seem that a lot of the things the Rebbe was saying were far off predictions or prophecies, right? And it's very often difficult to take, a far-off prediction or prophecy seriously, because you could say, I have a different prediction, or I don't believe in prophets.
Or it's up for interpretation, or you're right.
For sure.
Okay.
Right. Now, I think tragically, history has borne out the Rebbe's teachings, right? And you see that very much reflected in the rightward shift of Israeli politics, right? I mean, to say the disaster of Oslo, the disaster of the Intifadas, the disaster of October 7th, right? The ongoing morass in Lebanon, right? All these things.
Just the continuous, never-ending terrorist attacks.
For sure. Which, although honestly, they are getting a lot better since October 7th. There's a lot fewer.
Yeah, because our security has improved. We finally saw the threat for what it is.
For sure.
Until October 7th, every day felt October 7th in people's homes.
For sure.
People don't realize it's a personal Holocaust when two children and a teenager gets run over Friday on a bus by a
100%.
bus, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear.
The horrors have been consistent.
For sure. And to be clear, it hasn't stopped, right? But I mean, it's certainly become less, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Rebbe wouldn't be happy with that either, right? But I mean, that said, right, as time goes on, right, and you're saying, there's this personal Holocaust, right? So as time goes on, right, there's been a shift in the Israeli electorate, in the Israeli public opinion towards a so-called political right, because people saw, right, that, all this talk of peace was very nice, right? But peace without strength doesn't work, right? And I think October 7th was really a tremendous inflection point, a tremendous turning point in this discussion. Perhaps to answer your question with a story. So last year, I was invited to give a shir on Hasidus, actually, not on this book, to a bunch of PhD students at Tel Aviv University. And there was one student who came who had been a conscientious objector to the IDF. He didn't want to go to the IDF, right? Because the IDF is an immoral army, and he said he's not a Zionist, right? But of course, he's a good secular Israeli.
Pacifist.
He's a pacifist, exactly. Okay, then October 7th happened, right? And he's like, wow, those people actually want to kill me, right? So he's like, okay, I actually am a Zionist, and he tried to sign up for the IDF, right? But the IDF didn't want him because of his previous record. Be that as it may, really fascinating thing is that this same gentleman reaches out to me this week, and he's like, I'm not going to mention the name of the party, but like my leftist political party is going to make a stand in Tel Aviv this Friday. Would you and your wife, or maybe you and your friends come with tefillin to our stand, in order to demonstrate that we're all one people, right? So I think that it would have been nice, right, if people had listened to the Rebbe back then, but I do think now we're seeing a tremendous shift in Israeli society, for sure.
Words, sure.
Meaning where, even, people who are secular, people who say, on Shabbos, I, find it more comfortable to drive to the beach than to go to shul, right? But so for sure, so they're secular, right? Or, I don't want to eat, let's say Rav Landa's hechsher, right? But I won't eat pork, right? But that said, right, you have many people who are secular, but who are, let's say, open to hearing the Rebbe's messages. And I think in general, right, a good perspective for those of us who are in the space of talking about politics is that there's often a temptation, right, to engage in arguments, to engage in vikuchim. And the Rebbe said, to the extent possible, right, not to engage in argumentation, right, but rather to say that we're all one people, that we can engage in we can engage in civil and positive conversation. So I say broadly speaking, I'm actually quite optimistic, that there are many, and I've seen it myself, there are many young people, for that matter, old people, or middle-aged people who are very interested in hearing or listening to the Rebbe's message, even if they would not have been open to it several years ago.
And also because it's so in line with, I guess, what
common sense.
Common sense, exactly. Most Israelis, whether they want to admit it or not, are more on the right, because being on the right means security, means safety, means surviving.
For sure.
Okay, so I like that. That was great. You wrote this during October, during a live war.
Yes.
Okay, did that affect your writing though?
Yes, it definitely did.
You don't, in other words, no offense, I'm sure I know that you're brilliant and you're an author and you can write on a number of topics. The Rebbe the Rebbe has, for people who don't know, there's thousands and thousands of documented lectures and writings from the Rebbe. And a book like this can be compiled, but it's not compiled. You wrote it. And you put your emotions in it and your feelings in it. Can you tell us a little bit about what that felt like as a Lubavitcher chassid to be here all these years later, to represent what the Rebbe said, to put it down on paper, and to do it in such a time where, it was one of the most horrific eras of our lifetime, very, very personal. And if the Rebbe were watching, what do you think the Rebbe would have appreciated how things were conducted after October 7th? Okay, obviously, we have October 7th was, in other words, when that happened, I, as a Lubavitcher, felt like, but we told you so. We told you so. It was like a double whammy, right? Did you have that? Did you feel that? Like, come on, for God's sake, we told you, it's all here.
Sure. Okay, so I think that you're asking two questions. Number one is, what was the experience of writing the book like? Right. And then number two, what would the Rebbe say to the way that the current war was conducted?
Because it's a new world. We have the internet now, social media, things are, it's a new world. We can only assume the Rebbe would say this, that, or the other. But based on, let's say, the last 2 years.
Sure. Okay, so I would say in terms of the experience of writing the book, The book was written, I think, from a place of very, very strong emotion. I would say, in a certain sense, a degree of
devastation, disappointment.
Maybe perhaps pain, sadness. Also a certain sense of fear. What would what would happen? Like, and I remember like having this conversation. With a whole bunch of people in Chabad who were involved in content creation, right, and messaging, right, and there was a sense that we as the people who are creating Chabad messaging really need to go out there and share what it is that the Rebbe had to say. There's no question that the book was not written, as an academic project, but very, very much with the feeling that, a feeling of like it's really, really important that we get this message out, right? And I don't know, like at the time of the writing, like on the one hand, I thought maybe this will just go to some Chabad houses, but on the other hand, there's a possibility that it might actually get out there.
Well, now that it's on Moral Edge, I mean, it's going to go crazy viral.
Okay, but that's a shame. No, but meaning, thank God it has in fact gotten out there. But there was definitely a sense of great responsibility to articulate these ideas. And look, I very, very much hope that it will create something of a change or something of a small shift of the needle in terms of the public consciousness. Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking. I was going to ask you that. What do you think? What is something concrete that you wish could be put into place right now? Let's say that our government should start doing differently. That you feel that immediately, right now, that's not happening. That the Rebbe insisted on. Sure,
being unambiguous about settling Yehuda v'Shomron, and making it much easier for Jews to buy land there, making it much easier for Jews to settle there, very, very much ensuring their security and there being no two ways about it, right? Because very often there's a certain element of equivocation in terms of the way that the Israeli government deals with Yehuda v'Shomron.
I mean, we see now in the news, unfortunately, the stories from the crazy settlers or from the violent settlers burning down Arab villages, like they flipped on us. They literally flipped the script on us. And I mean,
which doesn't mean that we encourage young boys to go burn down villages.
We discuss this all the time. It's narcissistic abuse. You get to a point, you abuse and abuse and abuse, and then the person being abused, the victim reacts. And then you point the finger at them and say, look at their behaving. These kids grew up watching their animals being abused and their homes being shot at and their friends being murdered and all that stuff. And at some point, you raise children who are going to defend themselves. They're not friars.
For sure.
They're not suckers. Again, we don't encourage violence. Don't go burn down anything else. There's law. But it is a complex issue.
It is a complex issue. But but to your point about what the Israeli government should do differently, right? The Rebbe thought that was very, very tragic, that young Jewish boys need to take the law into their own hands, right? And the Rebbe thought it was a tremendous dereliction of duty on the part of the Israeli government. The Rebbe said because the Israeli government, right, is not doing what they need to do, right? They're putting these young Jews or they're putting these Jewish families in harm's way as like sacrifices on the altar of the UN, of the international community's opinion, of the international community ethics, right? So that would be one very significant change, which could happen already. Look, thank God there definitely are people, even of Lubavitcher extraction. There's a fellow named Elchanan Groner who's working very hard in activism in that space, and there are many, thank God. But the Israeli government definitely needs to do more to make life safe for Jews in Yehuda v'Shomron.
What about the army itself? I mean, the conversation about it being a secular institution that influences our bachrim, our young yeshiva students to go off the derech, to go off their way, and that it's not a proper environment, it's mixed and all those things. We can't deny that to be the fact. We now have our religious units, and some will argue that they're more strict than they are in the yeshivas as far as getting up and going to davening.
They are.
Right, because the army's the army.
Yeah.
So the issue with the army has always been that when you are in an army, you are in a collective unit, you answer to your commander. He's the boss. Obviously, you answer to our creator, the Eibishter. But what comes first when your sergeant tells you, get up, I don't care if you don't have time to put your tefillin or your tzitzis or whatever. What would the Rebbe say? What did the Rebbe say? What do you think the argument is when we see videos of ultra-Orthodox people fighting in the streets? I just posted a footage of Chassidim I think they were in some army base, physical violence. Rebbe was not a fan of all that. Is that something that you touched upon?
Okay, interesting. So this is not something that I deal with in the book, because the goal of this book is to provide a perspective on what the Rebbe thinks Israel should do to be a solvent country, and what Israel should do in order to defend itself, and how Israel can deal with our enemies.
Yes, it is a
perhaps
separate issue.
I deal with it perhaps in the last chapter of the book, right, about Jewish unity, right, which is that even though we have ideological disagreements, right, ultimately if we realize that we're all on the same team, right, then we'll probably be in a much better place. And the reality is that very often our enemy, and the Rebbe said this explicitly, very often our enemies attack us when they see that we're in a state of discord and disunity. You noted, actually, you mentioned the story of Achav and Ben Hadad in your preamble, right? So one of the other things the Rebbe says about Achav, King Ahab, was King Achav was an idolater. He worshipped Baal, right? I mean, he also worshipped Hashem, but he also worshipped Baal and Asherah, right? I mean, he was, broadly speaking, engaged in pagan cults, right? But God allowed Achav to win wars. Why, says the Rebbe? Because in Achav's time, there was Jewish unity. On the other hand, in the time of Bayesheni, in the times of the Second Temple Commonwealth, you had Jews who were very religious. They were much more religious than any Jew you ever met today, because Jews today don't, keep Seder Kachim and Tyrus, and the Jews then did keep, all those laws of purity and sacrifices. And yet, the temple was destroyed in their time because of the strife and because of the discord that existed amongst them. Very often, between different religious factions. Okay, so that was not the topic of this book. This book was not meant to engage in internal Israeli politics,
like
for sure. But let's jump into it, right? So it's interesting that in 1967. The Rebbe said quite explicitly that Israel's wars have the status of what the Rambam calls, what the Gemara calls, the Shulchan Aruch calls, a milchemes mitzvah, right? Which means a mitzvah war, right? I mean, it's not just a war that you can choose to do or not to do, but that everyone needs to engage in the war, right? And what's it called? The Rambam and the Gemara say like some very, very striking things about a milchemes mitzvah. Hakol yotzim al milchemes mitzvah. Everybody needs to go to a milchemes mitzvah. And then it says afilu chasan mechupasei v'kala mechupasei. Right, even a chasan and kala, no matter who it is.
Mention that the rabbi here is a chasan himself.
Indeed.
Yes.
Yes. Baruch Hashem. Right, but that said, I mean, everyone needs to go to war. Right, it doesn't give you an exception if you're learning in yeshiva. Right, and it's actually quite interesting that in the 6-Day War, right, the Rebbe mobilized the yeshiva Bachram, told them, do not leave Israel. Right, and go ahead and go to the front, not necessarily enlist, although it happens to be the Bachram and the Chabad Yeshiva and Teres Emes joined the home front command. You can see pictures of famous Chabad Chassidim, amongst them Shortzi, the well-known Shliach Chanale, right, who was wearing his home front command helmet, right. But the Rebbe very, very much encouraged Bachram to be involved in the war effort and to be involved in trying to support the country. Now, that said, it is interesting that the Rebbe said in other places, right, that there is a value in there being people who are learning in yeshiva, right? So the Rebbe did see a value of a certain cadre of people staying in yeshiva, a certain cadre of people staying in kollel. But I think what's very different about the Rebbe's perspective and the so-called, contemporary Haredi perspective, which you'll get, from going to your, local demonstration in Jerusalem, or your local closed street, on some blocked highway, or if you'd ask the New York Times or what have you, right? Is that ideology, which is not the Rebbe's ideology, is something called chevrat halomdim, which means the society of learners, right? It's the perspective, it's the belief that all religious Jews should basically live as a nation apart, right? And they should study the Talmud and the holy books all day, and they're effectively the Jews of the Jews. They're the true Jews, and that the secular people or religious Zionists are the non-Jewish Jews, and the non-Jewish Jews are meant to serve the Jewish Jews, right? So that was very, very much not the Rebbe's perspective, and it's also quite notable. You look at the Rebbe's letters, and very often the Rebbe is writing to his chassidim, to his disciples, his followers, who are all in the army, right? And I've spoken with, let's say, the mashpiyim, like the spiritual teachers and the Chabad yeshivas, who are now in their older age. Maybe we won't mention their names, but like very, very well known Chabad mashpiyim have told me their stories of being on guard duty in the Israeli army. So broadly speaking,
that they make the best soldiers, the Hasidic boys,
for sure.
Their integrity, their discipline, they're just as people. I mean, there's something about having a education like that you know why you're there. A lot of soldiers who enlist here in this country, unfortunately, don't necessarily want to be there.
Sure.
You learn in time, but when you go, because you have the Rebbe's backing and the Rebbe's support, and you know what you're fighting for, and then
for sure.
Yeah.
But that said, I do think that there's a tremendous nuance on this issue. Right? I feel like very often, like we like talking in taglines and slogans, right? Do go to the army, don't go to the army, right? And I think the correct answer is it's nuanced, right? And maybe to illustrate that point. So I myself never served in the IDF. But as first a Chabad rabbinical student and then a Chabad rabbi, I've spent much time going around to army bases all around the country, out of the country.
But that's also a role you play.
For sure.
That's the role you play.
Yes, 100%. But I would like to share an anecdote from that time. So on the one hand, you see that there are yeshiva units and there are yeshiva guys coming from, let's say, yeshivotas there, right? And like literally they're having a very, very frum time in the army, right? And they're coming from a society, they're coming from a community which really supports them in that. And they
from our neighborhood here, from Ramat Shiloh. For sure.
Right. As a matter of fact, I met Rabbi Slifkin's son on a base inside of Lebanon's territory.
He has the museum here.
Yeah. So there's definitely plenty of people from the community here. But there's
holiest soldiers. Jen Arley's a host on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer Early,
not familiar.
She's a host on the show, and her son Benjamin Meir Early. Now they have a rest place in a rehabilitation home in Tzfat in his name, but he was killed during October 7th. But the frummest, most God-fearing, devoted. For sure.
And I think what's quite tragic about what you're sharing right now is that there's the religious Zionist soldiers or religious soldiers in general are overrepresented amongst those who are killed in war.
Absolutely.
Because they actually believe what they're fighting for.
Sure. Well, them and the Ethiopians, a class thing or a statistic thing or a numbers thing.
Meaning I think both for, let's say the religious Zionists, religious in general, and for Ethiopians, right? There's very often a sense of, we're here for a reason.
To prove yourself,
right?
also.
Not even, perhaps, but like we're here because we believe in this, right? To say, they're in principle, economically, believe it or not, one could live, an easier life in Ethiopia, right? So people who came here, right, often came here under tremendous sacrifice. And I think when it comes to the religious Zionist soldiers, where they actually believe in it. But I wanted to share an anecdote from one of these army bases that I visited. So I was leading a Seder on a certain army base of a certain unit. And let's say in this unit, which is a combat unit, 70% of the soldiers were women, right? And, not exactly women who were educated in Beis Rivka, let's say, right? In terms of the way that they were, comporting themselves and their general vibe. Okay. And there's this soldier who comes in, right, in uniform with his gun, wearing a black yarmulke and a beard and a stack of svarim. Okay. And he's, asking me many questions over the course of the Seder. Anyway, so at the end of the Seder, like I come over to this guy and I'm like, what's your deal? You look like a fellow at yeshiva. Like, what are you doing here? Right. So he explains to me, look, I went to a hardcore Haredim yeshiva, anti-army yeshiva. Right. And then, there was I heard a story of a soldier who was killed and it was very inspired. So I decided to join the army. Right. And, he's like, now it's very, very hard for me, So I think that's like the proper test case of why it is that, there are Haredi communities, there are Haredi parents, there's a Haredi establishment, right, who's very afraid of the army. Because if you have a framework, right, which is allowing people, to go to the army and maintain their religiosity, that's wonderful, right? But for somebody like that, right, and I think the reality is that there are many people in secular Israeli society who would like to see the army, and in a certain sense, the army was designed this way, right, as an indoctrination machine. There are many in secular society who would like to use the army as a way to wean, the old school Jews, the backward Jews, off their old traditions, right, and turn them into the new Jew, right? And this guy, so let's say the guys in Hez they're having a great time, they're with their payas and they're learning, and they're having chavrusas and what have you. For sure. But this guy, right, is like sitting there, right? He doesn't have a community. He doesn't have a place in the army, right? He's coming out of yeshiva. He wants to serve Hashem, right? He's wearing a beard and a black yarmulke, right? But he has, no support, and the army is not giving him that support. I mean, he's very strong, right? But the army for him is in a certain sense like it's hell, right? I mean, he's having a really hard time because he's in a society which is antithetical to the values that he was raised with, and he's constantly having to deal with stress, pressure, temptation.
So it's not the best fit. It's not the
It depends. It depends for who, right? So I mean, I think there's nuance, right? It's a question of case by case basis, but then I think there's also the necessity that on the one hand, right, that meaning there's first of all there's the question of the individual. There's also a question of leadership,
right? So I was going to say I think some sort of reformation that starts from the top, for
sure. So I mean, to say the army, right? The way to solve the issue, right, would be that the army itself, right, and let's say the relevant characters in Israeli secular society have to have the perspective of we're not using the army as an indoctrination machine to try to turn the Haredim into non-Haredim. But the reality is they want that, right? And on the other hand, right, the Haredi community and leadership in the Haredi community needs to say, we're no longer living in Eastern Europe. We live in a Jewish state, and we're actually given the birth rate. We're
40% of first graders in this country are from religious homes.
Religious homes, yeah. Meaning, given the birth rate, right, we're soon going to be the majority.
Right. So that we have a social responsibility. Just the numbers. That's what the numbers say. Very tricky subject. I've yet though to meet a soldier who told me, "Oh, I went to the army, completely lost my faith, and hate religion now." So I don't know where those soldiers exist.
I think that if you make it a project, to spend 6 months going around to IDF bases, right, and meeting with soldiers, you'll meet many soldiers for whom the IDF was either their ticket out of the religious community, or it was the ticket that exposed them to a mode of being less religious.
But you're saying your ticket out of the Jewish community doesn't mean a ticket out of your faith. It could just mean out of the. I mean, we see what happened. It's shocking to see, but there are people who cannot go back to their neighborhoods when they're in their IDF uniforms. They'll be spit at or
for sure. But meaning, but I would say think for a moment. Right, about someone who values tznius, right,
modesty.
or modesty, right, or let's say boundaries with respect to intimacy, right, which is something that we take very seriously, right, in the Jewish community, which is really a tremendously beautiful value, right, and then you consider an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old. Right, being thrust into.
I've been to those parties. Every time I go, I say I understand what the threat is. I see the reservists come from. They're married. They come from healthy homes, and then you're thrown into these parties, and there's women wearing tight uniforms, and the atmosphere, and the music, and the secular culture, and there's every type of stripe, and the tattoos, and the long hair, and Israel. God bless them. We have.
It's a very diverse country,
and also because everyone's Jewish, at least people are concerned about making aliyah because if you make aliyah,
first of all, not everyone's Jewish.
We have our Druze and Arabs. Okay.
At the Seder I led this year, probably we had 90% Jews. It happens to be that the non-Jews were dating the non-Jews, so it worked out. Right. But the point is that the Israeli army is I think very often we idealize the Israeli army, and the Rebbe also idealized elements of the Israeli army, right, and saw the Israeli soldiers saw the secular soldier at the front as being a more holy person than the yeshiva bacher, because the secular soldier at the front is engaging in mysterious nefesh b'payil mamish, right, in literal self-sacrifice, right? Okay, so this is very true.
So let's not be naive and immature.
But on the other hand, right, anybody who thinks that the IDF doesn't pose challenges for impressionable young youth, right, should spend significant time visiting IDF bases. It's a very big mitzvah, by the way. Go make them a barbecue.
No, but I hear you 100%. I hear you 100%. Then that's why you said it's nuanced. There is no yes or no answer. In general, I'm not a big fan of extremism on any end. I don't think anyone should not show up to do their duty, and I don't think anyone should stop other people from showing up to do their duty. And I think people should be honest with themselves. I'm not going to give aitzes to Rosh Hashivas, the leaders of these institutions. They're far wiser.
Maybe you should.
I don't know if it's my job, but I will say that when people it expresses itself in violence, and when Israeli soldiers are fighting with Hasidim, Haredim, and we're here with one agenda and really ultimately one goal, to live peacefully in this land and to raise our children and usher in the Messianic era, it's heartbreaking. So it's important to keep having the conversation, and maybe that's really what's lacking. Just more conversation, more understanding, more look at it from our perspective, look at it from our we have a hard time with that in this country because everybody's a prime minister who thinks they're right. Mm-hmm. I could talk more and more, and I'm going to encourage people to pick up this book. We're going to put a link in the show notes.
I'll also note, by the way, that much of the book can be found on Chabad.org.
Let me ask you a question, and then I'm going to go into the outro, but real quick. For people watching, we have people who are hopefully Chabad, Hasidim of all different types. We have secular Zionists. We have people who are not Jewish, just who support Israel because they love it and they see that we're the good people. What can each of us do in the spirit of the Rebbe, in the spirit of a person who, as we said in the last hour and a half, just gave his whole life to this message that the Jews are important and that their security in Eretz Yisrael is important and that we should be supporting them from Chutz La'aretz. And despite the fact that Rebbe wasn't here, his eyes were constantly, Rebbe spoke about how Israel is the safest place in the world. We know during the Scud War, when people were, we didn't have social media, but we knew that it was terrifying. The Rebbe said not to fear, everything will be safe. And in fact, that's what it was. What can everyone do in the spirit of the Rebbe to make Israel a little bit safer?
Sure. So I think it's an awesome question. I think it's actually a great question to ask when we're talking about people who are in the space of Israel advocacy, right? And we'll talk about what not to do, right, in the spirit, and then what to do, right? I think very often, and this is quite pervasive, that when it comes to political causes that we believe about, it's not only true of Israel. You can look at it for people of any political stripe. There is very often a tendency to engage in arguments, right? And there's also a tendency to consume a lot of media in our echo chamber, and then also to produce a lot of media for the algorithm, be it like a Facebook post, a Twitter message, right? And that's generally speaking, less productive energy, particularly when the energy is coming from a space of anger and the space of and the space of fighting. And there could be something very cathartic about expressing that anger, engaging in those fights, but that's probably not a thing to do, right? So what I think the Rebbe generally encouraged people was to illuminate their space, right? Everyone, and that sounds like very trite advice, right? But everyone has their particular space, which they should illuminate, right? It could be your home, it could be your community, and everyone has very, very different circumstances. But broadly speaking, I think educating yourself on what's actually going on in Israel is a good thing, right? So you can educate people, as the Rebbe would say, in a manner of kindness and peace, right? Not in a manner of discord. Exactly, right? But then two, and this is perhaps quite perhaps slightly counterintuitive, is the Rebbe felt that one of the strongest things that would strengthen the state of Israel was Jewish education and engaging in Jewish practice known as mitzvos, right? So meaning to say,
increasing in acts of goodness and kindness,
for sure. But not just acts of goodness and kindness, particularly Torah and mitzvos, because if we study the Torah, right, we become Jews who know our story and believe in our story, right? And if we engage in mitzvos, we connect more deeply to the Jewish tradition, and ultimately, right, Judaism will survive, and Judaism will survive if we have Jews who are deeply connected to Torah mitzvos.
Like you and like me, thank you for being here. Thank you to our audience. The Rebbe used to say that the Jewish people are one body. When one part hurts, all of us hurt. He meant it as a description of reality. It's not just a metaphor. The reason why what happens to a soldier in Rafah is not separate from what happens in a yeshiva in Bnei Brak or a kitchen in Crown Heights is because we have the same body. And a leadership that treats one part of that body as expendable to protect another part, then we've already lost something. This is what makes Make Peace such a great book. Underneath it all the halachic argument and all the military analysis is the question whether we're serious enough to come together to have these conversations so that we can protect each other, the whole body. And yes, honest enough to live with those answers. This book is coming out in Hebrew. If you know someone in Israel who needs this conversation, get them this book. Otherwise, pick it up on Amazon. Thank you for being here, Rabbi Elisha Pearl.
Thank you, Chanale.
We're here every week. This is the Weekly Squeeze on Moral Edge. I'm Chanale. We will see you next time.